Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I'm just doing this video as a review of some of the timeline between 1850 and 1860. That way, if something is confusing to you from the YAWP source, or you just want to use the PowerPoint as a reference, during the time that you're writing, feel free to do that. This was a PowerPoint that was designed by Tom Ritchie, who is an AP teacher. So I just want to give credit where credit's due, but I thought it was a nice slideshow, and I think it's kind of really fits a lot of the content that we were looking at, might give you some extra detail. So looking in the earlier part of the decade of 1850, we can note some really key events: Compromise of 1850, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Brooks-Sumner incident. And, keep in mind some of the earlier context before the Compromise of 1850. We have a variety of different changes in the map. You might notice the annexation of Texas. Ultimately, Texas will be a state, but the United States goes to war with Mexico over issues related to the annexation of Texas. And the Mexican War leads to the Mexican Cession, which ends up expanding the American West. Of course, the unorganized territory. We also have, the land from the Louisiana Purchase, but between Texas annexation, the Louisiana Purchase, and the Mexican Cession, that concept of manifest destiny is a really big deal. There are a couple of different compromises that are really significant. One is California is admitted as a free state. And remember, prior to the Compromise of 1850, there had been debate about slave states and free states, and the Missouri Compromise had been set. The Compromise of 1850 is going to be a little bit different because now California is going to be admitted as a free state. California is admitted as a free state. There's going to be a stronger fugitive slave law. That's something that favors the South, whereas the first component, California, which is massive, admitted as a free state, that's something that favors the North. And then for the territory of New Mexico, there are a couple of things. One is that in that land that was added because of the Mexican Cession, you have popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is this idea that the population that proposes a constitution at the time of statehood could decide if a territory becoming a state, would be slave or free. The other thing would be federal assumption of Texas debt. There would be some land ceded by Texas in exchange for the federal government basically paying Texas's debt. And so there's like additional Western land. And the last thing is abolishing the slave trade, not slavery, but slave trade in Washington, D.C., something that Northerners really want. So if you consider some of the effects of the Compromise of 1850, now we have all of the states that would be, in the East, the annexation and statehood of Texas, and then you can also see California as a free state. Okay, so that becomes important. And it seems that the Missouri Compromise, just like it's like one of a few different compromises that had occurred throughout the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, is like a time of a great deal of compromise to try to avert crises. In the 1850s, it's a kind of a big question mark. Is that what's going to happen? We know that the Compromise of 1850 is supposed to be a final compromise, and of course, it fails. And it is the final compromise, but of course, it is not going to be an end to the crisis. A couple of things about this compromise: this idea of the stronger fugitive slave law. This becomes the really significant part of the Compromise of 1850, a part that creates a lot of tension between Northerners and Southerners. One of the things that it does is it creates like a forced role for Northerners who find fugitive slaves to have those individuals before a federal judge, not a trial by jury. So there's kind of some constitutional questions here, but because enslaved persons aren't treated as other Americans. They're not given the same degree of rights. And some states in the North start to avoid the way that these particular trials are going forth. So, in other words, you get some, renegade states that are going to kind of take matters into their own hands. They might guarantee a jury trial. They might even, kind of go into a space where, people are hiding some of the fugitive slaves. So this becomes something that some northern states, and we see it on the slide, Wisconsin, for example, where you see de facto nullification. The idea of nullification is when a state is basically nullifying or making, extinct a federal law. Okay, and so that's kind of what we see. These personal liberty laws is like Northerners maybe taking a stand against some of this. We know by 1852 that Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a fictional piece, Uncle Tom's Cabin, but she uses a great deal of characters who are kind of representative, a variety of different, types of Americans and some of their hypocrisies. And sometimes it's not even the hypocrisies that we would think. Sometimes the people who are most abolitionist can have and harbor a whole bunch of biases. So she's very specific in kind of making her points. And it is a book that sells incredibly and has some very influential types of effects. In 1852, there is a presidential election. Franklin Pierce is going to win this election. He's the electoral votes in blue, so you can kind of see the dominance. So this becomes a very significant, kind of win for Franklin Pierce. He is a Democrat. He's from New Hampshire, and he will be in office until 1857. This is not necessarily a successful presidency in terms of managing some of the compromise. Sometimes he gets referred to as a dough face. We have a variety of different, types of character. Sometimes you might hear of, copperheads, people who had southern instincts but were in the north, or a dough face. This would be like Franklin Pierce, a northern politician who kind of had a southern agenda. So somebody who's kind of catering to slavery and the interests of slave power, but at the same time is a northern politician. There are northern Democrats, so it's important to, kind of keep in mind in the mid 1850s, it's not so clear cut as like northerners and southerners. Like all the northerners said this and all the southerners said this. It's not the case at all. In the North, there are many people who are going to favor the Democratic Party. We will not yet see, at least at this point, we have the Democratic Party and the Whig Party that will soon be replaced by the Republican Party. So there's a lot of political shifts in this time period. And of course, slavery is the big issue in the West. And you have kind of political movements that are growing. Southerners, of course, want to expand slavery into the Western territories. They're seeking this as a way to expand what was, kind of moved and expanded into the Deep South, into the West. Free Soilers, another political movement where the goal is to keep slavery out of the Western territories. Free Soilers, which become an active political party, will be represented by people like Wilmot from Pennsylvania. They are not necessarily abolitionists. There will be abolitionists, a political movement where people have like a moral hatred of slavery. Free Soilers are not that group. They really want to preserve some of the Western expansion for free white immigrant labor, for the most part extending industrialization like you have in New England throughout the entirety of the West. Okay, this is a powerful kind of, political cartoon that gives us a sense. This is, free soil, white West, forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. This is kind of suggestive that, and we know this is not an abolitionist poster, because the person that is victimized in this particular cartoon is the free soiler who would, be hurt if slavery happened, because ultimately, they would be economically not competitive anymore. So free soilers are seeking some sort of like economic advantage in the West, and don't want slavery to compete with that particular power. Okay, so free soilers have a very particular, industrialization mindset, and very focused on white free labor. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which comes out as a result of this now territory, this large territory that's connected to the Louisiana Purchase. And we see Stephen Douglas, who's somebody who is influential in creating this idea of popular sovereignty. He kind of takes the reins as this like next generation of compromisers who are perhaps going to work in Congress to create some ways there might be, some, kind of parity between free and slave states. And I think I mentioned this in class, but some historians would argue that Stephen Douglas, who very clearly like wants to be president, and is seeking maybe the Transcontinental Railroad and some other types of resources, industrial infrastructure resources to go through his state of Illinois, especially the city of Chicago. And there is a move that he makes to suggest popular sovereignty, that perhaps his argument is that slavery at some point will die out in the West. It's not going to last there. But in the meantime, kind of a democratic approach to this would be popular sovereignty, so that people who were in the territory would decide if the state was going to be slave or free. The Kansas-Nebraska Act actually repeals the Missouri Compromise, because this is a territory that kind of defies where the parallel was for the Missouri Compromise. So now all of Kansas, all of Nebraska could potentially become slaveholding if popular sovereignty went in that direction. Senator Stephen Douglas is the author of this act, and this just gives you an image of him. He had all kinds of nicknames, but of course, he's kind of like a power, member of Congress at this point. And we know from class and some of the sources that we looked at that, this Kansas-Nebraska Act, once it gets instituted, is going to have a lot of issues, because we'll see what's called bleeding Kansas. Different pro-slavery groups and different anti-slavery groups head to the territories and start to set up space so that ultimately they can influence the popular sovereignty vote. Okay, so this leads to conflict. We see the border ruffians. These are pro-slavery folks from Missouri. We're also going to see anti-slavery folks from New England. So just like we saw, protests this past weekend, people are kind of protesting in a sense with their feet and moving to this territory. Between 1855 and 1859, 56 people die, in kind of conflict and massacres that exist in this particular region, where these various groups are essentially conflicting with each other. There's a great deal of, violence, or let's say threats for violence. This is one that's a Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, related to Harriet Beecher Stowe. He, argues that the sharp rifle is, kind of, a significant tool. You can look at the quote, supreme respect for this. So, here is a reverend, who's calling for this, that this is really a moral power. This rifle is important, maybe more so than the Bible. There are particular conflicts in quote unquote bleeding Kansas. There's an anti-slavery settlement, so people are kind of like tenting it up in Lawrence, Kansas, and we get a attack of pro-slavery settlers. We also get John Brown, who's an abolitionist, and we kind of know what happens to him. He is very much someone who believes that he is kind of granted permission, in a sense, from God to become this really significant, moral crusader of sorts. And he gets involved with his sons in the Pottawatomie Creek massacre, which leads to the deaths of slaveholders. So there's quite a bit of violence surrounding surrounding Kansas and Nebraska, and it's creating, additional challenges. Okay, I'll continue this video in the next, kind of slide thing. And, again, if this kind of helps with some of the timeline, if it's a little easier than the YAWP reading, feel free to use this. Okay, so this is just part one.